Good morning and welcome to Evil Ginger Miniatures for a bit of a different sort of a thing. Of course, it's a live stream conducted from the webcam of my laptop, so the equipment hasn't improved. But this isn't directly about painting. This is about why and how and what I paint for. I'm just sharing this with you because I happen to believe generally that unconsidered life is not worth living. So therefore, an unconsidered hobby isn't as good as one you've had to think about. And as an Olympic grade overthinker, this is probably that. But let's get this off my chest and get it out there. Now, I paint to play with the stuff that I paint. Even the commissioned stuff is painted so that the people who commissioned it can play with it. It's not necessarily painted for display purposes, though I like to think that some of my stuff is good enough for that. But you want it to be got out of the display cabinet and actually used. I don't do competition painting, and I don't make a fetish of taking an absolute age to do something. I want a figure I can play with. Some might say that's painting to wargaming standards and that's somehow inferior to display painting, but you're aiming for different objectives and you're using different techniques and different approaches because of that. It's much the same reason that if you're in an army, you don't use a rifle for a thing an artillery shell is worth. You need an artillery shell for, or you use the right tool for the right job. And as I say, all my stuff, commission or otherwise, is painted so that people can play with it. This imposes some limits on the techniques that I find useful, and it also poses some. It also means I do things that other people might not necessarily do. For example, I varnish everything. Varnish everything because I know I expect them to be handled. And I'm very old school when it comes to varnish, and I use and all my stuff gets a coat of gloss varnish like this one here. So it's all shiny, and that shiny is entirely deliberate, and it is due to a thin coat of polyurethane gloss varnish. Yacht varnish if I can get it, because it's probably the best quality and more UV resistant than the ordinary polyurethane gloss varnish. Not acrylic. Acrylic is a bit soft and won't provide a protection against basically oily fingerprints and people doing that and handling stuff. Because you should handle figures by the base, not by the figure. But we're talking about wargamers. Again, Merry Fields. Also gloss varnished. Takes a little while to go off, and I like to leave it a bit longer if I can, because you then overpaint it with a matte varnish to get to the finish. And finally, Black Agnes. Again, she's finished. Just needs the matte varnish stage and a bit on the base. Now, as I said, I paint to game with. I like modern models to look as nice as possible. I like them to look pretty for gaming purposes, but I paint to game with. And that said, I've lost my thread. I've just received a message from my niece because I sent her a rude message before this saying she shouldn't ring me up. She hasn't. She sent me a rude message which distracted me. Anyway, the gloss varnished. I also like to paint at a reasonable speed because I like my stuff done so I can play with it. And if I'm painting for other people, this reduces the price that I have to charge for it because, quite frankly, I charge for time. And if it takes me 3 or 4 weeks, that's a lot of money at national minimum wage for somebody to pay, and I don't like charging that because, again, I am enabling people to play a hobby to play the game if they're people who frankly don't like the painting part, or for whatever reason feel they've got too old to see properly, or various other things, or they look at the stuff that pro painters do on the internet and think they can't match the standard. It's not competitive painting. That's another point in my philosophy, is that the only person you try and get better than is yourself. This is why I don't enter painting competitions, and why I don't do several other things which lots of people do. I like to produce a product that is of good quality for me, and also for the people that I paint for, my customers, who I greatly appreciate as they keep the lights on and the internet paid for, and as painting is also therapy for me, stop me from going completely doolally-tap. I tend to paint as batches, because again, I'm painting armies and I'm painting forces. And I started out that way. Back in the day, I was somewhat forced to be a French Napoleonic player, because the chap over the road decided he was going into wargaming, knew I was into role-playing and modelling, and pretty much told me he wanted an OPFOR, opposing force. And I was the opposing force, and as a result, I painted several dozen, probably a dozen battalions of the old minifigs French, and we used Newbury rules, and a French battalion was 42 figures. And you didn't spend 2 years painting one individual figure if you wanted a battalion to play with in a couple of weeks when the next game was. As it was, we got into a little bit of a painting war, and I think he gave up when I beat him at it, hands down, because obviously he was older than me and he was working and he didn't have the time. He also was painting British, and I think British uniforms are a bit more fiddly than the French ones, and he couldn't keep up. Not even with my brother playing British as well, just to spite me, did he have the troops in the numbers to beat me. And he was, Newbury were not a particularly brilliant set of rules, but they were what we had at the time. This was sort of late 70s, early 80s, I think. Anyway, but my heart was always in ancients, not Napoleonics, and drifted off and did other things. And I went into 15mm and painted thousands, probably tens of thousands of figures over the years. But back to painting philosophy. The philosophy is to get it done to an acceptable standard that you can show off to people and play with within a reasonable time frame. And as a result, I have a fairly standard way of approaching a figure. If it needs constructing, I almost invariably construct it before I paint it. Occasionally I'll do bits, I'll do parts, but I will never paint on the sprue. In fact, I don't see why you would paint on the sprue, because having started off as an aeroplane modeler where you did a little bit of that, I found that it was a royal pain, because you had to scrape the paint off of the areas where you'd had to glue things, because plastic cement, which is what we were using on them at the time, would not stick plastic to painted plastic to painted plastic because of the way it worked. You could probably do it with super glue, but obviously super glue dries white. At least every sort I've ever seen dries white, and you'd have to overpaint it anyway. So you'd be building something that you knew you were going to have to retouch. And I am rather a fan of only painting stuff once, which is why I get so upset when stuff gets damaged and I have to go and do loads of stuff. I'd have to do it again, or I mess up and do stupid things like paint it with inadequately mixed white matte varnish and find out it's gone white, because, as I say, there's a matting pigment in white in matte varnish, which, if you let it dry thick enough, dries very white. and can be the ruination of some models. It's possible to fix, but again, it's another stage of faffing around, and you almost invariably end up overpainting some of it just to hide the white. So my approach to figures is I prime them white because it's easier. If I get them that have been primed black, I will use what is now known as slap chop, but I won't use slap chop for pre-shading. I'll use it so I can see what the hell's going on a figure, because I find painting black loses you all the detail. So you dry brush it quickly, white or grey, so you've got a gradation of detail, and then you paint it, knowing you can see what's going on. Now the way it gets painted is pretty much the same, and quite old school. I block in. I paint the figure. I paint areas a single colour. I will often paint the whole figure the dominant colour, like this horse is painted brown, and I will then overpaint both to add detail and to add other bits to the model, like painting this blanket. That will be different. The saddle will be a slightly different brown, and I've got a little bit of retouching to do underneath places, because again, that's an air bubble because of the speed I painted it at. This is normal, and I've been doing this since the mid-70s. So basically block everything in. This is why I don't need to use slap chop as a pre-shading technique, because the base coat you put on is relatively thick, or I should say rather than thick, pigment dense. You basically want it to cover, and you want it to cover and provide a base for you to work on. You both do the highlights from there and the lowlights. My base color for blocking in is normally the mid-tone, which is one of the reasons I like the idea of triads. You paint the figure the middle color of the triad, and then you do the shading in, then you use the other two colors to do shading and highlighting. I generally block the whole figure in before I do any shading. Again, force of habit and batch painting. You do cut things into minimal little stages, and you just cycle through them again and again and again. This was essential when you were painting with enamels, which took quite a time to dry, even if they were very diluted, and you were dealing with, and you'd have to be dealing with largish batches to get the right number, to make sure that by the time you got to the beginning again, it was all dry. I then, once I blocked everything in, start to work on the shading. I generally work on the lowlights first and then the highlights. But again, it's not necessary to do it in that order. It's just the way things normally work. They don't absolutely have to be done, from starting the face colors and moving out, or starting at other colors. I tend to do the biggest areas first. And I also paint the bases very early on, mostly because I find that a base that's got splatter of paint all over it looks unfinished, even if the model is otherwise finished. And this cons me into doing it a bit better. So muddy brown. There'll be more work done on that base. Again, that stone is painting a different color, probably grey. But I gradually build up. Now, the only time I do shading when I'm blocking in is if I'm using speed paint, or what was known back in the day as painting with washes, where you've got a figure primed or base coated white, or primed and base coated white. Sometimes you had to use a grey metal primer on metal figures, because that's all you could get, and the Humbrol stuff was a nice neutral colour. And you paint that, and then you base coat it white over the top, and then you would paint a thickish wash. This is the trick that contrast paints use. This is the pick trick that army painter speed paints use, and various other paints of that sort. You're painting with a thick wash. They've taken it up a notch from that, in that they've got various pigments in that behave in different ways and settle out at different levels. So you get a better density of paint, but you could have made, but I have made my own equivalent, though I don't recommend it, with mixing artists in with inks with, say, P3 paints, which have a liquid pigment. So you could get something not as good, but similar. And I'm having a coffee because I have a black heart and I need coffee. Also, I've been talking at people for 15 minutes and the voice and the mouth is getting a bit dry. Anyway, so I do some shading with speed paints when I'm shading with them, but mostly I do that afterwards. I like washes for shading, largely because even if you overpaint them, they tell you where the shading is. And for example, this figure here, which is one of the has been overpainted. Now, I made the silly mistake of not shaking up the Army Painter soft tone I used, and therefore it has ended up slightly shiny because the matting pigment almost separates out. Now, I'm not going to actually leave this with that much of a brown hint on it, probably on the face and the hands, and perhaps a little on the blouse, but I'm going to be using it as a guide to where the shading is. Now, it's pretty obvious where the shading is on a figure like this, but on some figures it can be very confusing, and how fabric particularly folds and lays, and I will overpaint with a darker blue, and I will highlight the raised bits, and you'll start to get a pattern of shading that makes sense, and you're not painting something. I mean, this is what I did here. I base coated it. I then painted it with yellow speed paint, which had much the same effect as the wash, because again, painted with washes. And then I went and I picked out the top with, highlighted with a feathered down white. Feathering down is a trick, which I'll explain later, where you use a relatively thick paint, lots of pigment, very little medium, and you work it into a thin coat. You put a tiny amount in and you spread it out. It's very hard on your brushes, which is probably one of the reasons I kill brushes at the speed I do. But basically, it's a way of getting a fairly high density light color over a dark color, and it's one of the reasons I don't like Vallejo. Vallejo don't have the density of pigment that I like, and they won't do that. They've got too much medium in them. All the ones I use had too much medium in them, and I'm disinclined to try them again. And then I went back over this with an orange speed paint, which is ironically called Zealot Yellow, to reinforce the low lights. And that's pretty much how I did it. You'll see it better when I've matte varnished her, but that's how I did it. For figures that I need large, that are in large groups, I'll tend to use a limited palette and just basically vary where I put the palette. Sometimes if they're, say, a historical army and they have a uniform, the palette is determined by what the uniform colours were. And in other cases, it's just determined by me having a think and deciding, well, these are rangery types, therefore browns, reds, greys, russets all fit in. And that's the colours I end up using. As I say, these are part way through the blocking out. I've still got some bits to do, and sometimes then I will do the shading, and then I'll do a wash, and then I'll shade from there onwards. And this one is nearly finished. I pretty much only have to do paint the sand on the base, and he's done. But again, this guy is very much an individual figure, and he was painted using much the same techniques as I've described. He'll be my apprentice for my wizard, for my Frostgrave warband. And again, limited palette, so that the warband is not only bound together visually, but you don't have to worry about having too many colours out at the same time. Not that that stops me, and I clutter my desk up horribly, as no doubt people who have seen my pictures of my workbench in the morning or the evening will be perfectly aware I have an existential struggle to get more than 6 square inches of bench to work on. And I have 2 quite significantly sized workbenches. Anyway, I think I've rambled enough. I will be doing a better version of this at some point in the future when I've got the editing software, and I will probably use it as a training exercise. But that's my philosophy of painting, and I just thought we might want to share. I wanted to share it with you. All right, bye-bye for now, and I will be back on Facebook later, and perhaps I'll see you there. Take care. Bye.